I was lying in a hospital bed with an intravenous line taped to my bruised arm when a local news segment caught my absolute attention. The morning broadcast was covering a newly launched luxury yacht sailing off the vibrant coast of Miami. In the background of the live panning shot stood my sister, my parents, and my husband laughing with expensive champagne glasses in hand. They were supposed to be in Atlanta attending a real estate conference. My heart pounded furiously as my phone chimed with a high-priority alert from my corporate banking account showing a pending charge for a luxury cruise package, totaling exactly $120,000. I dialed my husband immediately. When he answered, he sounded completely out of breath. I calmly asked where he was, and he smoothly told me he was at the office closing a massive and highly stressful real estate deal. I did not scream or cry or accuse him of anything. I simply told him to have a great day at work. Then I hung up the phone and decided it was finally time to destroy them all. The sterile smell of the recovery room at the Atlanta Medical Center was the first thing that greeted me when I regained consciousness. The steady, relentless beeping of the heart monitor felt unbearably loud in the completely empty room. 2 days ago, my physical body had simply given out. Working grueling 80-hour weeks hunting down complex financial discrepancies for the federal government had finally taken its inevitable toll. I had collapsed right in the middle of a high-stakes audit review, hitting the floor of my office before anyone could even reach me. When my eyes fluttered open, I had fully expected to see my husband Julian sitting anxiously by my bedside holding my hand. Instead, I saw only an unfamiliar nurse adjusting my fluid bags. She gave me a sympathetic look and gently explained that I had been unconscious for nearly 48 hours due to severe exhaustion and critical dehydration. When I asked about my family, she looked down at her medical chart with obvious discomfort. She told me the hospital administration had tried calling my emergency contacts, my husband Julian and my parents David and Patricia, dozens of times. Every single call had gone straight to voicemail. The hospital staff had left highly urgent messages regarding my sudden collapse and hospitalization. No one had responded. No one had bothered to show up. I pushed myself up against the stiff hospital pillows, feeling a cold, heavy numbness spread rapidly through my chest. For 32 years, I had always been the reliable one in the family. The quiet sister who kept her head down, studied relentlessly, and secured a highly stable and demanding career. My older sister Jasmine was the undisputed golden child of the family. She was a glamorous lifestyle influencer who never worked a standard job, but somehow commanded all of our parents' attention, affection, and financial resources. To them, I was just Sasha, the boring numbers girl who lived to work. I reached for the television remote to drown out the oppressive silence in the room. The morning news was running a special lifestyle segment about a highly exclusive celebrity yacht party down in Miami, Florida. As the camera panned slowly across the sun-drenched upper deck, something incredibly familiar caught my eye. I froze instantly. Leaning closer to the high-definition screen, I recognized the bright yellow designer sundress. It was Jasmine. Standing right beside her holding a cocktail and laughing uproariously was Preston, her wealthy white investment banker husband. And there, sitting comfortably on the plush white lounge chairs, were my parents David and Patricia, looking completely carefree as they enjoyed the ocean breeze. Then the camera shifted slightly to the right, and I saw Julian. My husband was standing dangerously close to a younger blonde woman. He was holding her waist intimately while they laughed at something Preston had just said. A sharp, violent vibration from the phone resting on my bedside table pulled my complete attention away from the television screen. It was an automated fraud alert from my secure banking application. I quickly unlocked the screen and stared hard at the notification. A pending transaction of exactly $120,000 had just been authorized. The merchant was clearly listed as Miami Elite Yacht Charters. The card used was not our joint personal checking account. It was my federal corporate black card. This was the specific card issued strictly to me as a senior partner at my forensic accounting firm, intended entirely and solely for high-level government contracts and official federal investigations. Panic should have been my very first natural reaction, but my rigorous professional training kicked in instantly. Forensic accountants do not panic in the face of financial anomalies. We follow the money trails. I opened the highly encrypted banking portal and checked the internal authorization logs. Julian had completely bypassed our standard household security protocols. I took a deep, steadying breath and dialed his personal cell phone number. It rang 4 times before he finally picked up the line. The background noise on his end was suspiciously muffled, as if he had hastily stepped into a quiet hallway or a private bathroom to take my call. "Hey, baby," he answered, his voice dripping with forced casualness and false affection. "How is the big audit going? You have been working so incredibly late lately. You barely even come home to sleep." I stared blankly at the television screen where the yacht segment had just finally wrapped up. "I am doing just fine, Julian," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Where are you right now?" He let out an exaggerated and dramatic sigh. "Where do you think I am today? I am stuck at the brokerage office. Preston threw a massive commercial real estate deal my way, and we are currently drowning in endless paperwork trying to close it before the weekend. It is completely exhausting, but you know exactly how it is. We have to secure the bag for our future together." He was lying straight through his teeth to his hospitalized wife. I could almost hear the distinct rhythmic sound of the ocean breeze in the faint background of the cellular connection. I did not mention waking up in the hospital. I did not mention seeing the live news broadcast on television. I did not even mention the young blonde woman I had just seen him holding so intimately. "Well, I truly hope you managed to close that tough deal," I said softly. "Enjoy your time at work today." I hung up the phone and let it fall quietly onto my lap. For decades, I had endured my parents' constant, endless comparisons. I had tolerated their blatant, unapologetic favoritism toward Jasmine and her arrogant, corrupt husband, Preston. I had foolishly believed Julian when he said my long hours were putting a strain on our marriage, and that he just wanted us to build a beautiful, comfortable life together. But looking at the digital footprint he had just carelessly left behind, I saw the brutal, unvarnished reality. I opened my work laptop, which my boss had thoughtfully sent to the hospital room, and began aggressively tracing the digital signature on the yacht transaction. Julian had not just guessed my password. He had submitted a forged power of attorney document to the bank, falsely claiming I was medically incapacitated to gain secondary access to my most sensitive federal financial accounts. I thought he was dealing with a clueless bookkeeper who would just blindly pay the bill and cry quietly about his infidelity. He had completely forgotten what I actually do for a living. I investigate federal financial crimes for the government. I track down corporate embezzlers, ruthless money launderers, and white-collar thieves. He had just willingly handed me a documented paper trail of federal wire fraud on a silver platter. My finger hovered over the digital option to freeze the corporate card immediately. Freezing it would instantly stop the transaction, but it would also alert him that I knew about his crime. Instead, I smiled a genuinely cold and calculating smile. I clicked directly on the credit limit modification tab. I bypassed the standard security cap and intentionally doubled his available credit limit. I wanted them to spend much more. I wanted them to rack up exorbitant charges across multiple state lines. I wanted them to leave a digital trail so deep and undeniable that the federal government would have absolutely no choice but to intervene. "Let them dig their own graves," I whispered to the empty hospital room. I closed the laptop, pulled the intravenous line straight out of my arm, and firmly pressed the call button for the attending nurse. I had an empty house to thoroughly search and an entire empire of lies to burn straight to the ground. My name is Sasha. I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from exhaustion when I saw my family on the morning news. They were partying on a luxury yacht in Miami while I was hooked up to an intravenous line. Then my phone vibrated. A $120,000 charge had just hit my corporate black card. I called my husband, Julian. I asked where he was, and he calmly told me he was at the office. I did not scream. I just smiled and doubled his credit limit. The smell of antiseptic woke me. I tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea forced me back into the stiff hospital pillows. 2 days ago, my body simply gave out. Years of untangling massive financial fraud for federal agencies had broken me. I collapsed right in the middle of an audit review. I turned expecting to see Julian by my bed. The chair beside my bed was completely empty. The heavy door pushed open and a doctor stepped inside. I asked her where my husband was. Her expression shifted into a look of deep pity. "We tried calling him," she said softly. "We left over a dozen urgent voicemails explaining that you had collapsed. No one answered and no one has called us back." The silence felt suffocating. My parents had always viewed my career as a boring numbers job, while they worshipped my older sister Jasmine. She was an influencer who drained their bank accounts but gave them the high society image they craved. Julian was supposed to be my partner. I reached for the television remote to drown out the quiet. A local channel was broadcasting a live segment about an exclusive yacht party off the coast of Miami. The reporter was walking along the dock, pointing at a massive vessel packed with beautiful people drinking expensive champagne. I leaned closer to the screen. My breath caught in my throat. Standing on the upper deck of that exact yacht was Jasmine. She was wearing a bright yellow designer sundress and laughing loudly. Right beside her stood her wealthy investment banker husband, Preston. I stared in absolute shock as the camera panned slightly to the right. My parents, David and Patricia, were lounging comfortably on white leather chairs, clinking their glasses together. Then I saw Julian. My husband was not just on the yacht. He was standing near the railing with his arm wrapped tightly around the waist of a younger blonde woman. I recognized her immediately. It was the younger sister of Preston named Victoria. Julian pulled her close and whispered something in her ear, making her throw her head back in laughter. A violent vibration from my phone shattered my trance. I picked it up from the table. It was an automated high-priority security alert from my federal banking application. I unlocked the screen and felt the blood drain completely from my face. A transaction for exactly $120,000 had just been authorized to Miami Elite Yacht Charters. The card used was not our joint checking account. It was my federal corporate black card. This specific account was issued directly to me as a senior partner at my forensic accounting firm, intended strictly for high-level government contracts and official federal operations. My hands did not shake. I did not cry. My rigorous professional training took over instantly. I opened the encrypted portal and checked the internal access logs. Julian had bypassed our household security measures. He submitted a forged power of attorney document to the bank, falsely claiming I was medically incapacitated to gain secondary access to my sensitive financial accounts. He thought he was dealing with a clueless bookkeeper who would blindly pay the bill and cry about his infidelity. He forgot that I tracked down ruthless money launderers and white-collar thieves for a living. I dialed the personal phone number of Julian. It rang 4 times before he answered. The background noise on his end was noticeably muffled. "Hey, baby," he said, his voice dripping with forced casualness. "How is the big audit going? You have been working so late lately, you barely even come home." I kept my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of emotion. "I am doing just fine, Julian. Where are you right now?" He let out an exaggerated sigh. "Where do you think I am today? I am stuck at the brokerage office. Preston threw a massive commercial real estate deal my way, and we are currently drowning in endless paperwork trying to close it before the weekend. It is completely exhausting, but we have to secure the bag for our future together." I was lying effortlessly to his hospitalized wife. I could actually hear the distinct rhythmic sound of the ocean breeze in the faint background of the cellular connection. I did not mention waking up in the hospital alone. I did not mention seeing the live news broadcast on television. I did not even mention Victoria. "Well, I truly hope you managed to close that tough deal," I said softly. "Enjoy your time at work today." I hung up the phone and let it fall onto my lap. For decades, I had endured my parents' constant comparisons and their unapologetic favoritism toward Jasmine. I had tolerated Preston and his corrupt behavior. I had foolishly believed Julian when he said he just wanted us to build a beautiful, comfortable life. But looking at the massive digital footprint he had just carelessly left behind, I saw the brutal reality. He had just willingly handed me a documented paper trail of federal wire fraud on a silver platter. My finger hovered over the digital option to freeze the corporate card immediately. Freezing it would instantly stop the transaction, but it would also alert him that I knew about his crime. Instead, I smiled a genuinely cold and calculating smile. I clicked directly on the credit limit modification tab. I bypassed the standard security cap and intentionally doubled his available credit limit. I wanted them to spend much more. I wanted them to rack up exorbitant charges across multiple state lines. I wanted them to leave a digital trail so deep and undeniable that the federal government would have absolutely no choice but to intervene. Let them dig their own graves, I whispered to the empty room. I ignored the frantic protests of the attending physician as I signed the release forms against strict medical advice. He warned me that my blood pressure was dangerously unstable and that leaving could trigger another sudden collapse. I politely thanked him for his profound concern, requested my personal belongings, and walked straight out the heavy double doors of the Atlanta Medical Center. The humid Georgia heat hit my face the exact moment I stepped onto the concrete pavement. The bright afternoon sun felt blinding after spending 2 days trapped inside a sterile hospital room, but the sharp warmth anchored me to reality. I hailed a yellow cab and gave the driver the address to my upscale property located deep in Buckhead. The ride felt agonizingly slow. The highway traffic was incredibly dense and completely unmoving. I stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar city skyline blur past me, while my mind raced through 1,000 different financial scenarios. Every single forensic investigation always starts with one tiny single thread, and Julian had just handed me an entire spool of evidence. I paid the driver in cash and walked up the pristine cobblestone driveway of the home I had paid for, with my own sweat and sleepless nights. The massive mahogany front door unlocked with a quiet and familiar click. I pushed it wide open and stepped into the suffocating silence of an entirely empty house. The stark contrast between my recent hospital stay and the immaculate interior of my home felt deeply jarring to my senses. Natural sunlight poured freely through the large bay windows, illuminating the expensive modern furniture Julian had insisted we buy to maintain his false image as a highly successful real estate broker. I walked slowly through the spacious living room, noticing the very subtle signs of their hasty and excited departure. A half-empty ceramic coffee cup sat abandoned on the edge of the marble kitchen island. Jasmine had left a discarded designer shopping bag draped carelessly over one of my expensive dining room chairs. But what caught my immediate and complete attention was resting quietly on the glass entryway table. It was a sleek silver briefcase. I recognized the expensive leather handle instantly. It belonged to Preston. My wealthy white brother-in-law was so intensely obsessed with catching that luxury flight to Miami that he had carelessly left his primary work briefcase sitting right inside my front door. My heart began to beat with a slow and steady rhythm of anticipation. Preston was an arrogant investment banker who truly thought he was completely untouchable. He viewed me with the exact same quiet disdain my family did, treating me like a boring human calculator while he played the grandiose role of the ultimate financial genius. I picked up the heavy silver briefcase and carried it straight down the long hallway into my private home office. I set it gently down on my mahogany desk and popped the dual combination locks with absolutely zero hesitation. Preston was incredibly predictable and always used his wedding anniversary for every single password he ever created. It took me less than 3 seconds to crack the physical lock and open the lid. Inside sat his high-end corporate laptop resting next to a stack of meaningless real estate brochures. I pulled the device out, booted up the machine, and was immediately greeted by a formidable enterprise-level security screen. For an average everyday person, this glowing login prompt would be an impenetrable brick wall. For a senior forensic investigator who routinely cracks federal tax evasion syndicates before breakfast, this was nothing but absolute child's play. I connected his laptop directly to my specialized dual-monitor workstation and ran a background decryption sequence I normally reserve for hostile corporate audits. The intricate password barrier fully collapsed in less than 4 minutes, giving me total administrative control. I was completely inside the machine with unrestricted access to every single file he had ever created or hidden. I bypassed his standard boring work folders and navigated straight into the deeply hidden partition drives he thought nobody would ever find. Financial criminals always keep a secret shadow ledger to track their dirty money, and Preston was absolutely no exception to this golden rule. I swiftly opened a securely encrypted digital folder labeled simply as Family Ventures. My eyes quickly scanned the digital files, and the breath literally caught in my dry throat. Row after row of scanned legal documents and unauthorized banking transfers completely filled my wide computer screen. I double-clicked to open a specific file titled Residential Equity and felt a freezing cold wave of absolute disgust wash over my entire body. It was a secondary mortgage application for my beautiful home in Buckhead. Julian and Preston had secretly and maliciously taken out a massive $500,000 loan against the hard-earned equity of the house I personally owned. I scrolled rapidly down to the final signature line on the last page of the binding legal contract. There was my name perfectly and flawlessly forged at the very bottom of the document alongside a completely fake notary stamp. I systematically traced the outward flow of the $500,000 through the attached banking statements. The stolen money had not gone into Julian and his struggling real estate firm. The entire $500,000 had been directly and deliberately routed into a newly established corporate account registered exclusively to Jasmine. They had literally stolen the equity straight out of my home to fully fund my older sister and her brand new luxury fashion line. They were building her fake, glamorous empire directly on my stolen financial foundation. I continued digging even deeper into the secret drive and suddenly found a synced email thread between Preston and someone labeled as Patricia Personal. It was my mother. My stomach violently twisted into tight knots as I opened the most recent message in the chain. I read the exact cruel words my own mother had typed to her son-in-law just 3 days ago. Do not worry about Sasha finding out, she wrote with stunning arrogance. She is just a clueless numbers girl who is too busy working to ever notice anything. Bleed that house dry, Preston, because Jasmine deserves to be a real chief executive officer. I sat completely frozen, staring at the monitor. My mother's cruel words burned into my retinas, but I refused to cry. She had called me a clueless numbers girl. She had actively encouraged Preston to bleed my hard-earned home completely dry, just so her golden child Jasmine could play the role of a glamorous chief executive officer. I did not slam the laptop shut or scream into the empty house. I simply took a slow breath and let the icy cold reality of their betrayal sharpen my focus. Forensic accounting is not just about reading spreadsheets. It is about hunting down the hidden stories that arrogant criminals try to bury in the dark. Preston and Julian thought they were so incredibly smart, but they had absolutely no idea how deep my federal investigative skills actually went. I closed the email thread and opened the primary financial ledger for the boutique of Jasmine. My eyes scanned the incoming wire transfers. The stolen $500,000 from my secondary mortgage had landed in her corporate account exactly 4 days ago. But the money did not stay there. Ordinary thieves would have simply kept the cash and started buying expensive inventory or paying for lavish marketing campaigns. Preston was an investment banker, so he tried to be much more sophisticated. The ledger showed that less than 24 hours after the stolen equity hit the account, it was immediately dispersed. I watched the massive sum fragment into 80 microtransactions. Each transaction was precisely calculated to fall just under the federal reporting threshold of $10,000. This is a classic financial evasion tactic known as smurfing. Preston was deliberately structuring the deposits to avoid triggering an automatic review by the Internal Revenue Service. I began running a tracing algorithm I had personally developed for the Treasury Department a few years ago. The software rapidly followed the scattered money trail across the global banking network. The funds were completely routed out of the country. They landed in 3 separate holding accounts registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. I pulled up the corporate registration files for these specific offshore entities. They were all registered under generic names with phantom directors, acting as empty shell companies. Preston was using his extensive banking knowledge to wash the stolen money through an international financial maze. But the flow of money did not make complete logical sense. If they just wanted to steal my house equity, there was absolutely no reason to build such a complex offshore laundering network. You only build a washing machine of this massive scale when you have a continuous stream of dirty laundry. I minimized the boutique ledger and began hacking into the restricted financial files associated directly with the real estate brokerage firm of Julian. Julian had always claimed his business was struggling due to a tough housing market. He frequently complained about low commission rates and difficult clients. I opened his master revenue sheet and instantly saw the glaring discrepancies. He was inflating commercial property appraisals and taking illicit kickbacks while pocketing the undocumented cash. The sheer volume of his dirty money was staggering. But Julian had a massive problem. He could not simply deposit hundreds of thousands of dollars of illegal kickbacks into a standard bank account without the federal government asking questions. He needed a legitimate front to wash the dirty money clean. I split my dual monitors and placed the real estate ledgers right next to the fashion boutique accounts. The entire criminal operation suddenly became crystal clear. Julian was sending all of his illegal real estate kickbacks directly into the exact same offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Preston was managing the international transfers. They had stolen the $500,000 of equity from my home simply to provide the initial clean capital to establish the boutique. Now they were mixing the dirty real estate money with the clean stolen equity inside the offshore accounts. Once the money was thoroughly mixed, Preston routed it right back into the United States disguised as foreign investment capital for the fashion brand of Jasmine. Jasmine was then taking that washed money and claiming it as legitimate retail revenue from selling her luxury clothing line. Her glamorous fashion boutique was not a real business at all. It was a highly structured and deeply illegal federal money laundering syndicate. My husband, my sister, and my brother-in-law were running a massive criminal enterprise while my parents cheered them on. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted federal flash drive. This tiny device contained military-grade encryption and was strictly monitored by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I plugged it directly into the side of the laptop Preston had so carelessly left behind. I initiated a complete mirror clone of his entire hard drive. The progress bar began creeping toward 100%. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the digital evidence of their utter destruction safely transfer into my hands. Every forged signature, every illegal wire transfer, every offshore bank account routing number, and every single incriminating email between my mother and Preston was now securely locked inside my federal drive. They had absolutely no defense. They had left a pristine trail of undeniable evidence that would easily secure federal convictions and decades in federal prison for every single one of them. The progress bar finally hit 100%, and the cloning process confirmed completion. I safely ejected my encrypted drive and tucked it deep into my pocket. I was just about to shut down the machine when a bright white notification banner suddenly slid into the top right corner of the monitor. It was a synced message from the personal phone of Preston. I leaned closer to the screen to read the incoming text. The message was sent directly from Julian. My heart beat with a slow and icy rhythm as I read the exact words my husband had just typed from the deck of a luxury yacht in Miami. "The boring wife is still stuck in the hospital," Julian wrote with obvious joy. His complete lack of guilt was absolutely breathtaking. "I am moving Victoria into the guest room tomorrow morning right before we all fly back to Atlanta. Make sure you keep the parents completely distracted so we have the entire house perfectly to ourselves and do not tell anyone else." Exactly 72 hours after my quiet escape from the hospital ward, the heavy oak front door of my Buckhead home swung violently open. Loud, arrogant laughter echoed down the long hallway, shattering the silence I had maintained all week. The conquering heroes had finally returned from their luxury Miami cruise. I stood perfectly still in the center of the kitchen, gripping the cold marble island. Julian led the procession carrying a massive travel bag over his shoulder while flashing his signature predatory smile. Right behind him walked my older sister Jasmine and her husband Preston. My parents, David and Patricia, proudly brought up the rear. Their skin was deeply tanned from days spent lounging on the sun-drenched upper deck of a yacht paid for by my stolen federal corporate card. They burst into my kitchen, treating my personal sanctuary like an ordinary hotel lobby. No one asked how my hospital recovery was going. No one mentioned my sudden and dangerous physical collapse. They simply expected me to instantly resume my assigned role as the invisible servant of our household. "Well, look who is finally out of bed," my father David announced loudly, dropping his golf clubs onto the pristine hardwood floor. "You look absolutely terrible, Sasha. You are pale as a ghost, and you really need to get some sun." I kept my face completely blank and offered a weak, submissive nod. "I am still recovering from severe exhaustion, Dad," I said softly, keeping my voice intentionally fragile. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "Stop being overly dramatic about a simple fainting spell, Sasha. Jasmine worked incredibly hard all week, preparing for her boutique launch, and you do not see her complaining." Jasmine tossed her expensive designer sunglasses onto the kitchen counter and let out a dramatic sigh of fake exhaustion. "It is so incredibly stressful being a female founder," she whined, smoothing down her silk resort dress. "Managing international supply chains and dealing with high-end fashion investors takes a massive toll on my mental health. I just desperately need a good home-cooked meal right now." Preston leaned against the refrigerator, ignoring the fact he was standing inside a home he just illegally mortgaged. "That is exactly why we decided to throw a surprise family dinner right here," he declared smoothly. "We figured the least you could do while resting at home is cook a decent meal for the family who works so hard to represent our legacy." He crossed his arms over his chest, radiating an unbearable sense of entitlement, while waiting for me to eagerly accept his ridiculous demands. The sheer audacity of their demands was breathtaking. They had drained my home equity, spent over $100,000 of federal funds, and were now openly demanding that I serve them dinner while recovering from a serious medical emergency. I lowered my gaze to the floor, playing the exact pathetic part they expected to see. "Of course," I whispered softly. "I can start preparing a roast right now." I spent the next 2 hours quietly moving around my own kitchen, cooking an elaborate meal for the very people plotting my total financial ruin. During the dinner, my father openly criticized the seasoning on the roast while my mother loudly praised the fake business acumen of Jasmine. Julian played the role of the deeply concerned husband, pouring my water and rubbing my shoulder with fake affection. I chewed my food silently, forcing myself to swallow every single insult they threw at me, because the ultimate payoff would make this temporary humiliation worthwhile. He performed his deceptive marital duties perfectly for his captive audience, all while secretly planning to move his blonde mistress into my basement the very next morning. When the meal concluded, the family eagerly relocated to the spacious living room to drink brandy and discuss their fictional business ventures. I remained behind in the kitchen, slowly washing the dirty porcelain dishes by hand. I heard the distinct sound of heavy footsteps approaching from behind. Julian walked into the kitchen and quickly closed the heavy sliding wooden door, sealing us off from the rest of the noisy family. The charming smile he wore in the dining room instantly vanished, leaving behind a look of cold, calculating urgency. He stepped directly into my personal space, trapping me against the wet edge of the steel sink. "Hey, babe," he whispered, adopting a low, persuasive tone that he typically reserved for vulnerable real estate clients. "I know you are not feeling fully recovered yet, but I really need a huge favor from you tonight. My commercial brokerage firm is undergoing a massive routine compliance audit, and the accounting department is breathing down my neck over some missing spousal documentation." I dried my wet hands on a kitchen towel and looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "What kind of documentation?" Julian, I asked softly. He reached into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a neatly folded legal document. "It is just a standard joint tax waiver for the commercial real estate portfolio," he lied smoothly, without a single hesitation. "The federal regulators just need your verified signature to confirm that our marital assets are properly separated for liability purposes. It is completely routine and incredibly boring, but if you do not sign it tonight, my entire commission structure for the quarter gets frozen." He pressed the thick document firmly onto the marble counter and pushed a sleek black pen into my right hand. His body language was highly aggressive and specifically designed to force compliance through physical intimidation. I slowly looked down at the printed pages. The document was beautifully formatted with fake banking logos and complex legal jargon meant to confuse an ordinary citizen. But I am a senior forensic investigator who builds federal financial traps for a living. My trained eyes instantly scanned past the generic introductory paragraphs and locked directly onto the specific numerical routing codes buried in the fine print. I recognized the unique federal tax identifiers immediately. This was not a standard joint tax waiver. This was a comprehensive asset liquidation mandate targeting my entire 401k retirement fund and moving it to the offshore firm of Preston. I smiled, ignoring the rage inside my heart. I uncapped the pen and cheerfully signed my name to seal their fate. I watched the dark ink flow smoothly onto the crisp white paper as I forged my signature on their fraudulent trap. Julian let out a heavy sigh of relief, completely convinced he had just stolen my retirement fund. He snatched the thick document from the marble counter and offered me a sweet smile of fake gratitude. He quickly turned around to leave the kitchen, eager to hand the paperwork straight over to Preston. As soon as his tailored jacket disappeared around the corner, I calmly reached down and pulled the black pen back out of my pocket. This was a highly specialized vanishing ink pen, strictly utilized in federal financial fraud training seminars. Within 48 hours, my signature would completely evaporate, leaving behind nothing but a blank, useless line. Furthermore, the leather folder I had just handed back to them contained a microscopic radio frequency identification tracker, securely hidden deep inside the binding. That tracker was registered to an active criminal investigation file monitored by the Internal Revenue Service. Preston was about to carry a federal tracking beacon straight into his illegal offshore laundering hub. I was carefully wiping down the marble counter when Julian suddenly strolled back into the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon and leaned casually against the refrigerator. He took a slow sip and looked at me with an expression of fake sympathy. He casually mentioned that Preston had a younger sister named Victoria, who was currently going through a tough romantic breakup. He smoothly explained she desperately needed a quiet place to stay for a few weeks to clear her head. According to Julian, family always takes care of family, so he had invited her to move into our home starting tomorrow morning. There was just one minor logistical problem, he added, taking another arrogant sip. Victoria required absolute comfort and plenty of natural sunlight to heal properly, so she needed to occupy the primary guest suite on the second floor. That specific room currently served as my dedicated home office, where I handled my federal accounting audits. Julian coldly informed me that I would need to pack up my entire workspace tonight and relocate everything down into the unfinished basement. I did not argue about the blatant disrespect. I simply nodded my head and softly apologized for any inconvenience my work equipment might cause his grieving guest. The very next morning, a black sports utility vehicle pulled directly into my driveway. Victoria stepped out wearing an outrageously expensive designer trench coat and oversized sunglasses that hid half her face. She walked straight through my front door without bothering to knock. She was carrying two massive luxury leather travel bags, which she dropped right onto the center of my imported living room rug. She pulled off her sunglasses and looked around the space with a distinct expression of entitled boredom. When her cold eyes finally landed on me, she did not offer a polite greeting or say thank you for opening my home to her. Instead, she simply pointed a manicured finger at her luggage and sharply told me to carry her bags upstairs, while being careful not to scratch the expensive leather. Julian rushed into the room and immediately jumped to assist her, treating her with a level of frantic devotion I had never once received from him. He carried her bags upstairs while she followed closely behind, complaining loudly about the long drive and demanding a fresh glass of sparkling water. She treated me exactly like a hired maid inside the very house I had purchased with my own money. I remained completely silent and walked down the narrow wooden stairs into the cold, damp basement. The air down there was heavy and smelled faintly of wet concrete and old cardboard boxes. I spent the afternoon dragging my heavy wooden desk and computer equipment into the darkest corner of the underground room. I arranged my dual-monitor forensic workstation on top of the desk and connected everything to a secure encrypted router I had hidden behind a stack of storage bins. Julian thought he was punishing me by exiling me to the basement so his secret white mistress could sleep comfortably in my beautiful upstairs guest room. He failed to realize that he had just provided me with the ultimate undisturbed surveillance bunker to monitor their every single move. I sat in the freezing darkness of the basement, wrapping a thick wool blanket tightly around my shoulders to fight off the bitter cold. The digital clock on my primary monitor slowly blinked, displaying 2 in the morning. The entire house was completely silent. I typed a complex sequence of alphanumeric commands into my mechanical keyboard. I easily bypassed the basic residential security firewall Julian had installed last year and hacked directly into our own internal smart home camera system. The secondary monitor instantly illuminated with 12 high-definition video feeds, capturing every single angle of the property. I maximized the specific camera feed monitoring the second-floor hallway right outside the primary guest suite. The monochrome night vision footage showed the hallway was totally empty for several minutes. Then the door to the master bedroom slowly creaked open. Julian stepped out into the dark hallway wearing only his sleep pants. He looked cautiously over his shoulder to ensure the house was quiet before creeping straight down the hall and slipping into the room of Victoria. I instantly switched my screen to the hidden camera feed I had secretly installed inside the guest suite smoke detector months ago. The high-definition video streamed perfectly onto my large monitor. Julian walked over to the mattress and pulled Victoria into a passionate embrace. She leaned back and laughed silently at something he whispered. The infrared lens caught a sudden, brilliant flash of light reflecting off her chest. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor and felt my heart completely stop inside my chest. Victoria was wearing a heavy diamond necklace that sparkled aggressively even in the dark room. It was not just generic luxury jewelry. It was the exact vintage heirloom diamond necklace my late grandmother had left to me in her final will. The irreplaceable family necklace Julian had sworn he accidentally lost at the dry cleaners 6 months ago. I stared quietly at the glowing screen as pure burning rage consumed my entire physical body. The morning sun barely penetrated the narrow basement windows when I heard the familiar clicking of my mother's designer heels echoing on the hardwood floor directly above my head. Patricia had arrived unannounced at my house, complaining loudly about the local traffic. I walked up the wooden stairs, leaving my forensic workstation running in the shadows. I found her standing in my kitchen, aggressively reorganizing my spice rack while criticizing the organic coffee I had purchased. I did not offer her a warm greeting. I walked straight to the marble island and looked her directly in the eyes. I asked her exactly how much Julian got for selling my grandmother's heirloom diamond necklace. Patricia froze with a glass spice jar gripped tightly in her manicured hand. She did not look surprised or confused by my specific question. Her face contorted into a mask of pure condescending irritation. She slammed the jar down onto the counter and let out an exasperated sigh. "You are becoming dangerously paranoid and hysterical, Sasha," she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "Your brain is clearly still scrambled from that fainting spell at the local hospital. Julian told us he lost that old necklace at the dry cleaners months ago, and you are just trying to start stupid, unnecessary family drama." I kept my voice perfectly flat and calm. "I saw the necklace last night, Mom," I said coldly. "Victoria was wearing it around her neck while she was sleeping in my own guest room with my husband." My mother did not gasp in shock or demand an explanation for the infidelity. She simply rolled her eyes and let out a cruel, dismissive laugh. "This is exactly why Julian is losing interest in you, Sasha," she stated with absolute zero remorse. "You are constantly working late, tracking boring numbers, and acting like a depressed victim. Look at Victoria. She is vibrant, she is young, and she actually understands his massive ambition. A successful man, like Julian, needs a woman who can support his elite lifestyle, not a miserable bookkeeper who hides in the dark basement." The sheer brutality of her words felt like a physical blow to my chest. My own mother was openly defending the woman sleeping with my husband under my roof. I stared at her powdered face, and suddenly the final piece of their psychological puzzle snapped into place. Julian and Preston were not just fooling my parents, they were bribing them. I remembered the illegal offshore shell companies and the hidden corporate accounts. How much are they paying you? I asked softly. What is the exact percentage you and Dad are getting from the new boutique of Jasmine to look the other way? Patricia stepped forward and jabbed her index finger directly into my shoulder. We are securing the financial legacy of this family, she hissed. Preston and Julian promised your father a 5% stakeholder cut of the new luxury fashion brand once it officially launches next week. We are finally going to have the wealth and social status we truly deserve. You need to stop being selfish, Sasha. Just keep your mouth shut, do your little accounting job, and let the adults handle the real business. Your marriage was a total failure anyway, so at least let your sister become a millionaire. She turned around, grabbed her expensive handbag, and stormed right out of my kitchen without looking back. The front door slammed shut, vibrating the walls. I stood completely alone, absorbing the absolute total corruption of my biological family. They were not just turning a blind eye to the adultery of my husband. They were actively facilitating his affair because he had promised them a pathetic cut of a federal money laundering syndicate. My parents were willing to sell my home, my sanity, and my marriage for some dirty, illegal money. I walked back down into the freezing basement and dropped heavily into my office chair. I did not shed a single tear for the mother I had just lost. She had made her final choice. The sudden sharp ringing of the doorbell interrupted my dark thoughts. I checked the live security feed on my monitor. A delivery driver in a uniform was standing on my porch holding a small square package. I hurried up the stairs and opened the door. He handed me a digital clipboard to sign for the delivery. The package was heavily insured and addressed directly to Julian from an exclusive custom jewelry boutique located in downtown Atlanta. I carried the box down into my basement bunker. Julian was upstairs taking Victoria out for an expensive brunch, so I had time to inspect his mail. I used a thin, heated blade to carefully melt the industrial adhesive along the bottom flap without tearing the cardboard. The box slid open smoothly, revealing a black velvet jewelry case nested inside protective foam. I slowly lifted the velvet lid. Resting perfectly against the dark fabric was a massive custom-designed diamond engagement ring. It was easily a 3-carat flawless stone, surrounded by a halo of smaller crushed diamonds. I pulled out the folded receipt tucked underneath the velvet box. Julian had paid exactly $85,000 for the ring, using a cashier's check drawn from the same offshore holding account Preston had set up to launder my stolen mortgage equity. I noticed a small customized gift card tucked inside the lining of the box. The handwritten note was incredibly brief, but devastating. It read to my beautiful Victoria, I cannot wait to make you my wife and celebrate our new empire together at the boutique launch next week. Forever yours, Julian. He planned to publicly propose to his mistress, right in the middle of the luxury brand launch of my sister. He would use the grand opening of their money laundering front to humiliate me and announce his new life with Victoria. I carefully closed the black velvet box and used a specialized bonding adhesive to perfectly reseal the bottom flap. I slowly walked upstairs and placed the delivery box right on the glass entryway table, exactly where Julian would find it when he returned. I smiled a truly terrifying smile. Julian thought he was setting the stage for his perfect romantic victory. He had absolutely no idea he was just delivering the final nail for his federal coffin. The very next morning, my cell phone began vibrating violently against the cold concrete floor of the basement. The glowing screen displayed an incoming call from Jasmine. I let it ring 3 times before slowly picking up the device and pressing the green button. I did not even get a chance to say hello before her sharp, arrogant voice pierced through the tiny speaker. She did not ask how my recovery was going or if the basement was warm enough for a sick person. She simply launched right into her aggressive demands. Sasha, I need $30,000 transferred to my boutique account by noon today, she commanded with absolute authority. The grand opening for my luxury fashion line is just 3 days away, and the exclusive catering company requires their final payment up front. I kept my voice intentionally quiet and hesitant, playing the exact role of the timid sister she always bullied. Jasmine, $30,000 is a massive amount of cash to pull together on such short notice, I whispered weakly. I am still on medical leave, and my husband Julian handles most of our liquid assets now, and he tightly controls all of my spending habits. My sister let out a cruel, condescending laugh that echoed through the phone. Figure it out right now, Sasha, she sneered. You live in a very gorgeous house in Buckhead, while contributing absolutely nothing to the social standing of this family. You should consider this $30,000 as your basic rent for being allowed to remain part of our legacy. Mom and Dad agree that you owe me this catering money for missing my initial investor dinner while you were resting in that hospital bed. She hung up the phone without waiting for my response. I sat in my dark underground office and smiled a genuine smile. Jasmine thought she was extorting her boring sister to pay for expensive champagne and caviar. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me the perfect golden opportunity to plant a federal Trojan horse directly inside her illegal operation. I turned to my forensic workstation and opened a highly classified communication portal. I did not call a local luxury catering service. I contacted a specialized covert operations division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation based in downtown Atlanta. This specific tactical unit handles deep cover financial raids and white-collar stings. I requested an immediate deployment of a full undercover catering team for the grand opening event. I spent the next hour carefully drafting a specialized corporate check for exactly $30,000. I did not use my personal banking account or the offshore accounts Preston thought he controlled. I routed the payment directly through an active federal honeypot account established by the Department of the Treasury. A honeypot is a digital financial trap designed to look like a completely vulnerable target, but it actually mirrors and tracks every single piece of banking data that touches it. Any account that accepts funds from this specific check would be instantly permanently tagged by federal monitoring systems. The moment they deposited my money, their entire criminal network would be visible to federal agents in real time. I put on a simple gray sweater and drove my car straight to the new boutique located in the most expensive retail district in the city. The storefront was covered in black privacy paper preparing for the grand reveal. I knocked timidly on the glass door until Preston opened it. My arrogant white brother-in-law was wearing a custom-tailored suit and holding a clipboard looking like the ultimate master of the universe. He looked down at me with his usual expression of quiet disgust. "What do you want, Sasha?" he asked, blocking the entrance. I kept my head lowered and handed him the crisp corporate check. "Jasmine called and said you needed the catering funds for the launch party," I said softly. I managed to scrape it together from my business account. Preston snatched the check from my hand and inspected the $30,000 amount with a greedy smirk. He looked at the generic corporate name printed at the top of the paper and laughed. "Good girl, Sasha," he mocked, patting my shoulder patronizingly. "It is about time you started pulling your weight around here and supporting the real entrepreneurs in this family. Run back home to your little basement now, we have important elite guests to prepare for." He slammed the heavy glass door right in my face. I walked slowly back to my car, feeling the cool autumn breeze against my skin. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I watched the live federal tracking portal connected to the honeypot check. I only had to wait exactly 14 minutes. Preston was so incredibly eager to wash the new funds that he did not even wait for the bank to open tomorrow. He used a mobile deposit application on his phone to instantly transfer the $30,000. But he did not deposit the check into the legitimate business account of the boutique. He endorsed the back of the check and deposited it directly into his primary offshore laundering account in the Cayman Islands. A bright red notification banner flashed across my encrypted screen, confirming the successful digital handshake. Preston thought he was smartly siphoning free money from his pathetic sister-in-law. He failed to realize he had just personally signed a binding commercial invoice with a federal sting operation. By endorsing that specific honeypot check and pushing it into his hidden offshore network, he had just irrevocably linked his primary money laundering hub directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The tracking beacon was now permanently embedded inside his most secure financial fortress. I started the engine of my car and drove away from the boutique. My phone buzzed with a new message from the lead tactical agent assigned to the fake catering team. The message simply read, The Trojan horse is safely inside the outer gates, and the extensive catering menu is fully prepared for Friday night. I smiled a very slow and satisfying smile, knowing the luxury event of Jasmine was about to become the most expensive federal raid in the history of Atlanta, Georgia. The very next afternoon, heavy footsteps pounded down the basement stairs. My father, David, and mother, Patricia, descended into my workspace. Patricia crossed her arms tightly while David glared at me with absolute contempt. They came to demand a formal apology for my recent behavior. Patricia loudly declared my paranoid accusations about Julian and Victoria were destroying the peaceful fabric of our family. She coldly stated, Julian was working incredibly hard to build his real estate empire, and my hysterical delusions were causing him severe emotional distress. My father informed me I needed to make immediate financial amends to my husband as an apology, David explained. Julian desperately needed a brand new luxury sport utility vehicle to entertain his wealthy commercial clients. Because my sudden hospital stay had supposedly disrupted the cash flow of his firm, my parents demanded I personally co-sign the auto loan. They framed this massive liability as my required punishment for being a neglectful wife. I kept my expression completely blank and stared at their angry faces. Ordinary victims would have cried or screamed at the sheer audacity of this demand. I simply nodded my head submissively and agreed to accompany them to the car dealership right away. I knew this was the perfect opportunity to set a public trap. We drove to the most exclusive dealership in the affluent Buckhead district. The massive glass showroom floor was packed with shiny luxury vehicles and wealthy Atlanta residents. Julian was already waiting near the front entrance, wearing a smug, arrogant smile. He had picked out a fully loaded black premium vehicle that cost well over $100,000. Patricia hugged him and loudly praised his excellent taste, ensuring everyone in the showroom heard her. Julian kissed my cheek with fake affection and thanked me for finally being an obedient wife. I kept my eyes lowered and followed them into the glass-enclosed office of the finance manager. The finance manager was an older man who seemed very eager to close such a massive commission. He handed me a thick stack of printed applications and asked for my primary financial credentials. Julian and my parents sat comfortably sipping complimentary sparkling water while they waited for me to bind myself to a decade-long debt. I carefully filled out the lengthy credit application. I deliberately did not use my clean, protected federal banking information. Instead, I meticulously entered the exact routing numbers and Social Security identifiers directly linked to the fraudulent secondary mortgage Preston and Julian had secretly taken out against my home. I also listed my parents as the primary financial guarantors. I handed the completed paperwork back to the finance manager and offered a polite, timid smile. He typed the detailed information directly into his highly secure automotive lending portal. I watched his facial expression shift from eager anticipation to total confusion and then to absolute panic. The federal banking system operates with ruthless automated efficiency. The moment he submitted those specific routing numbers, the lending software instantly matched the application to the active federal fraud alert I had secretly triggered days ago. The computer screen flashed a silent, bright red warning, explicitly instructing the manager to stall the suspects and immediately contact local law enforcement. He nervously cleared his throat and excused himself, claiming he needed to grab a printer cartridge. Julian leaned back in his leather chair and began bragging to my father about how the new luxury vehicle would drastically elevate his local social status. Patricia chimed in to remind me how incredibly lucky I was to be married to such an ambitious and handsome man. I simply stared at my hands folded neatly in my lap, waiting patiently for the trap to spring fully shut. Exactly. 12 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the dealership swung open, and 4 uniformed police officers marched aggressively onto the pristine showroom floor. The entire dealership fell completely silent as the armed officers walked with clear purpose directly toward the finance office. Patricia stopped talking mid-sentence and her jaw dropped open. The lead officer entered the glass room and demanded to know which individuals were attempting to secure a loan using federally flagged credentials. The finance manager pointed a trembling finger directly at my parents and my husband. The officer bluntly informed them that the social security numbers and mortgage documents they had just submitted were intimately tied to a massive active investigation involving federal wire fraud and illegal money laundering. Julian instantly went pale as a ghost and stumbled backward, knocking over his glass of water. David stood up and began shouting at the police officers, aggressively insisting there must be some sort of ridiculous clerical error. The officers were completely unimpressed by the arrogant demands of my father. Two of them grabbed David by the arms and firmly pushed him against the glass wall, reading him his Miranda rights out loud for the entire luxury showroom to hear. Patricia began sobbing hysterically and begging the officers to let them go, claiming they were wealthy, respected members of the Atlanta community. Wealthy clients stopped browsing the luxury vehicles and began recording the humiliating scene on their mobile phones. Julian cowered in the corner of the office, desperately trying to hide his face from the recording cameras. As the officers pulled out their metal handcuffs to arrest my sobbing parents, I finally stepped forward to play the role of the devoted and heroic daughter. I placed myself directly between the armed officers and my terrified family. I kept my voice shaking and pleaded with the police captain to allow me to clear up this terrible financial misunderstanding. I quickly pulled out my legitimate federal corporate credentials and displayed my high-level security clearance to the commanding officer. I quietly explained that my family was simply caught up in an unfortunate corporate identity theft scam, and I personally guaranteed their immediate release. The police captain reviewed my credentials and reluctantly agreed to release them into my custody. Julian grabbed his coat and quickly ran outside. My parents followed behind me in shame. When we reached the parking lot, Patricia and David turned to me crying softly. They thanked me profusely for bravely saving them all, completely unaware I had orchestrated their entire humiliating public downfall from scratch. Exactly 3 days before the highly anticipated boutique launch, my cell phone vibrated violently against the cold concrete desk in my basement. The glowing screen displayed an urgent message from Jasmine demanding my immediate physical presence at her new retail location. I did not hesitate or offer any convenient excuses to avoid the meeting. I simply grabbed my car keys and drove straight into the heart of the most expensive luxury shopping district in Atlanta. The storefront had been completely transformed since my last visit. The dark privacy paper had been entirely peeled away, revealing massive floor-to-ceiling glass panels and bright gold lettering spelling out the name of her fake fashion empire. I pulled open the heavy glass doors and stepped onto the pristine white marble floors. Racks of ridiculously overpriced garments hung from brushed brass fixtures, while tiered crystal chandeliers aggressively illuminated the massive open space. To the untrained eye, it looked like a perfectly legitimate and highly successful business venture. But I knew the cold, clinical truth behind the shiny facade. Every single marble tile, every crystal drop, and every silk dress hanging on those racks was paid for with my stolen home equity and the offshore money laundering transfers organized by Preston and Julian. Jasmine was standing near the center display table, barking aggressive and demeaning orders at a team of incredibly nervous decorators. She was wearing a custom-tailored white silk pantsuit and holding a digital tablet like it was a deadly weapon. When she finally saw me standing awkwardly near the front entrance, she rolled her eyes and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She strutted directly over to me, clicking her expensive designer heels loudly against the marble flooring. She did not bother to thank me for driving all the way out there, or ask how my physical recovery from the hospital was progressing. She simply looked me up and down, with an expression of absolute undisguised disgust. She coldly informed me that my everyday clothes were painfully boring, and my overall aesthetic was completely unacceptable for her elite brand image. She proudly stated that the launch party on Friday night would be packed to maximum capacity with wealthy private investors, local politicians, and high society influencers from all across the city. Then she leaned in uncomfortably close and told me I was simply too socially awkward and plain to mingle with her sophisticated guests. She bluntly stated that my mere presence on the main showroom floor would deeply embarrass the family and completely ruin the glamorous high-end atmosphere she had worked so hard to meticulously cultivate. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger toward a small, dark room located near the back entrance of the building. She commanded me to work the entire grand opening event as her designated coat check girl. She explicitly wanted me hidden safely away in the shadows, handling the heavy luxury jackets of her wealthy guests, while she bathed in the glorious spotlight of her fake success. She actually tried to frame this massive insult as a generous favor to me, claiming I would feel much more comfortable avoiding the high-pressure social interactions of the evening. She told me to consider this humiliating task as my mandatory contribution to the financial legacy of our family, since I clearly offered absolutely nothing else of value to them. An ordinary person would have felt deeply crushed by this blatant and cruel disrespect from their own biological sister. I simply lowered my head and stared directly at the polished marble floor, playing the exact role of the timid, broken scapegoat she desperately needed me to be. I kept my voice intentionally soft and slightly trembling to sell the performance. I apologized profusely to her for my absolute lack of fashion sense and my obvious social inadequacies. I quietly told her that she was completely right about my flaws and that I would be deeply honored to handle the coats for her important elite friends. I promised her I would stay completely out of sight and follow her strict instructions perfectly without causing any unwanted disruptions. Jasmine smiled a truly wicked and triumphant smile. She reached out and patted my cheek patronizingly, treating me like a slow and obedient child. She told me to make sure I wore a plain black uniform so nobody would accidentally mistake me for a real invited guest at her prestigious event. She then quickly turned her back on me and walked away to continue shouting at the floral arrangers, leaving me standing alone near the entrance. I walked quietly out of the bright, luxurious showroom and drove directly back to my dark basement bunker. Jasmine honestly thought she was punishing me by banishing me to the tiny, isolated coat room for the entire night. She completely failed to realize that the coat room was the absolute ultimate tactical position for a federal forensic investigator. The high-level financial criminals coming to her party would never willingly hand their personal belongings to an undercover federal agent, but they would gladly and carelessly toss their luxury coats to an invisible silent servant hiding in the background. It was the perfect blind spot for me to operate completely undetected by their security. I sat down at my dual-monitor workstation and unlocked the heavy secure metal lockbox hidden beneath my desk. I pulled out a specialized forensic tracking kit I had secretly acquired from my division at the Bureau. Inside the dense black foam padding sat 50 microscopic global positioning system trackers. They were completely flat, smaller than a standard shirt button, and entirely undetectable by regular security scanners. These specific surveillance devices were actively linked directly to a highly secure federal tracking satellite monitored by my team. I pulled out a small sewing kit and a pair of surgical tweezers. I spent the rest of the afternoon carefully practicing the swift, precise motion of slipping these tiny devices inside the thick fabric seams of expensive winter coats. Preston had eagerly invited his entire network of corrupt investment partners and dirty commercial real estate associates to attend this lavish launch party. He was unknowingly bringing the entire active criminal syndicate right directly to me in one convenient location. When those arrogant men confidently handed me their expensive designer jackets on Friday night, I would seamlessly sew a permanent federal tracking beacon deep into their inner pockets without them ever noticing a thing. These microscopic trackers would allow the Federal Bureau of Investigation to map their daily movements, identify their secret meeting locations, and expose every other hidden associate involved in their offshore banking scheme. I would effectively tag and permanently monitor every single high-level money launderer in the city of Atlanta, all while Jasmine proudly believed she had finally put her boring little sister exactly in her proper place. The silent, invisible coat check girl was about to become the absolute downfall of their entire criminal empire. Friday night arrived with a suffocating wave of heavy southern humidity and the blinding flash of professional photography equipment. The luxury boutique of Jasmine was completely transformed into a pulsing beacon of fake wealth and stolen equity. I stood silently inside the cramped, windowless coat room located near the rear service entrance of the massive showroom. The air inside the tiny space was incredibly stale and smelled faintly of fresh paint and industrial cleaning solvents. Jasmine had forced me to wear a hideous, oversized black polyester uniform that hung off my frame like a cheap trash bag. She specifically chose a garment that was 3 sizes too large, ensuring I looked as frumpy and pathetic as humanly possible. The coarse fabric scratched uncomfortably against my skin, but I wore it without a single complaint. My humble appearance was the absolute perfect camouflage for a federal investigator hiding in plain sight. The grand opening event was an immediate and overwhelming success for their money laundering syndicate. The main showroom floor was absolutely packed to maximum capacity with the most powerful elite members of Atlanta high society. I peeked through the small opening of the coat room door and watched local politicians, corrupt commercial real estate developers, and wealthy private investors drinking expensive imported champagne. The heavy bass of the curated background music vibrated through the floorboards, while waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of gourmet appetizers. Preston and Julian had spared absolutely no expense for this extravagant illusion. My actual work began the exact moment the front doors officially opened to the public. Arrogant, wealthy men in custom-tailored suits walked confidently up to my dark little counter. They did not make eye contact with me or bother to say good evening. They simply tossed their heavy wool overcoats and expensive designer jackets across the wooden counter, expecting the invisible servant to neatly hang them away. I played the role flawlessly. I kept my head down, offered weak, polite smiles, and carefully carried their luxury garments into the deepest shadows of the coat room. Once I was completely out of their direct line of sight, my rigorous federal training took over. I worked with ruthless mechanical efficiency. I laid each expensive jacket flat against a small wooden folding table I had set up in the back corner. I pulled out my surgical tweezers and the microscopic tracking beacons I had prepared earlier in the week. With swift, precise movements, I made a tiny, imperceptible slit inside the inner silk lining of each coat. I slid the federal tracking device deep into the fabric and used a specialized quick-drying fabric adhesive to seamlessly seal the tiny hole. The entire process took less than 15 seconds per jacket. I was systematically tagging the most powerful white-collar criminals in the city of Atlanta right under their noses. Every time I hung a tagged jacket onto the long metal rack, I mentally checked off another target for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. About an hour into the lavish event, I heard the familiar, loud, and obnoxious laughter of my mother cutting through the loud ambient noise of the party. I stepped closer to the doorway and watched Patricia and David strolling proudly through the center of the showroom. They were dressed in outrageously expensive formal wear paid for by the illicit funds flowing out of the offshore accounts. My parents were eagerly working the room, greeting wealthy politicians and shaking hands with corrupt real estate moguls as if they were actual royalty. What made my blood run completely cold was the young blonde woman walking directly between them. Victoria was wearing a stunning red silk evening gown and holding a crystal champagne flute. She looked incredibly comfortable and totally integrated into my biological family. My mother placed her hand affectionately on the bare shoulder of Victoria and pulled her toward a group of elderly private investors. I stood quietly in this dark coat room and listened to my own mother introduce the mistress of my husband to the wealthy elite of Atlanta. "I want you all to meet Victoria," my mother announced loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the marble floor. "She is the brilliant new business partner of my son-in-law Julian, and she is absolutely the bright, vibrant future of his commercial real estate firm. We are just so incredibly blessed to have such a dynamic and intelligent young woman joining our inner circle tonight." My father, David, nodded his head in enthusiastic agreement and proudly patted Victoria on the back. The investors smiled politely and welcomed Victoria warmly, completely unaware. They were shaking hands with a woman wearing stolen heirloom jewelry who was actively sleeping with a married man. My parents did not glance toward the coat room even once. They walked right past my tiny dark window, completely ignoring the fact that their actual biological daughter was standing 10 feet away, wearing a cheap, oversized uniform and working as a glorified servant. They had totally erased me from their public narrative and replaced me with a shiny new accomplice who fit perfectly into their glamorous criminal illusion. I did not feel a single drop of sadness or rejection watching them parade Victoria around the luxury boutique. I only felt a profound sense of absolute clinical detachment. They were willingly tying themselves to a sinking ship. A few moments later, Julian and Preston joined the group holding fresh drinks and laughing loudly at a joke my father made. Julian wrapped his arm casually around the waist of Victoria, while Patricia beamed with genuine pride at the disgusting display of public infidelity. Preston checked his expensive gold watch and smirked at Julian, whispering something about the massive amount of retail revenue they were currently generating for the offshore accounts. They honestly believed they had executed the perfect financial crime. They thought they were untouchable gods, standing at the absolute peak of the Atlanta financial food chain. I turned my back on their pathetic celebration and walked deep into the shadows of the coat room. I had successfully tagged over 40 jackets belonging to the most crucial members of the illegal syndicate. Every single target was now a glowing red dot on a federal monitoring screen. The trap was now fully loaded, armed, and completely inescapable. I reached under the scratchy collar of my hideous oversized uniform and gently tapped the tiny flesh-colored communication earpiece securely hidden deep inside my right ear canal. The device clicked softly, connecting me directly to the mobile command center parked exactly 3 blocks away from the luxury boutique. The background static hummed quietly for a brief second before the deep, commanding voice of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, lead tactical agent, came through the encrypted channel. His words were sharp, professional, and completely devastating to the false reality happening just outside my dark little door. The tactical perimeter is entirely secured, the agent confirmed, his voice vibrating directly into my ear. All federal search and seizure warrants have been officially signed by the federal judge and registered in the system. The armed tactical teams are currently in position at all front and rear building exits. We are holding the line and eagerly awaiting your final signal, Director. I pressed my finger gently against the flesh-colored earpiece hidden deep inside my right ear canal. I kept my voice to a barely audible whisper, so the wealthy guests dropping off their jackets would not hear me speaking to a federal agent. Hold the perimeter and keep all tactical teams out of sight, I murmured into the hidden microphone. Do not breach the building until I give the absolute final command. I want to let these arrogant fools dig their graves a little bit deeper before we bury them. The Federal Tactical Director acknowledged my order with a crisp double click over the encrypted radio channel. I lowered my hand and stared out through the small window of the dark coat room. The heavy bass of the club music suddenly faded into a soft ambient melody. The low murmur of the elite Atlanta crowd began to quiet down as the bright overhead spotlights shifted their focus toward the center of the massive showroom floor. Julian was walking confidently up the small set of temporary acrylic stairs onto the main presentation stage. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that cost more than most people earn in a month. He grabbed the wireless microphone from the silver stand and flashed his signature predatory smile at the sea of corrupt politicians and dirty real estate developers. He looked like the ultimate master of the universe, bathing in the warm glow of stolen money and fake success. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight to celebrate this incredible milestone, Julian announced, his voice echoing powerfully through the high-end surround sound speakers. Tonight is not just about launching a luxury fashion brand. Tonight is about celebrating the power of family legacy and the brilliant vision of my sister-in-law Jasmine and my brother-in-law Preston. The crowd erupted into polite applause and raised their crystal champagne flutes in the air. Jasmine blew kisses to the audience while Preston nodded smugly from the front row. Julian waited for the applause to die down before pacing slowly across the illuminated stage. He lowered his voice into an intimate, persuasive tone that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. Building an empire is incredibly difficult work, he continued smoothly. It requires ruthless dedication, endless ambition, and most importantly, having the absolute right people standing by your side. For a very long time, I felt like I was carrying a massive burden on my shoulders. I was chained to a life of mediocre expectations and boring routines that were slowly draining the life out of my soul. I watched his face carefully from the shadows of my cramped little room. He was publicly humiliating me without ever explicitly saying my name. The wealthy guests hung on his every word, completely captivated by his fake vulnerability. But a successful man cannot fly if he is tied to an anchor, Julian said, his voice growing louder and more passionate. You have to surround yourself with people who understand your vision and match your energy. You have to find someone who inspires you to conquer the world instead of dragging you down into the dark basement of mediocrity. He paused for dramatic effect and looked directly at the front row. That is why tonight is also a celebration of new beginnings for me personally. He extended his hand toward the crowd. Victoria, please come up here and share this beautiful moment with me. The crowd parted respectfully as Victoria stepped forward in her stunning red silk evening gown. The stolen heirloom diamond necklace of my late grandmother sparkled aggressively against her skin as she climbed the stairs. Julian wrapped his arm tightly around her bare waist and pulled her flush against his side. He leaned into the microphone and smiled a cruel, triumphant smile. Ladies and gentlemen, I have finally found my true equal, he announced proudly to the cheering crowd. I have found a woman who radiates beauty, intelligence, and vibrant ambition. Victoria is my new business partner in every sense of the word, and the bright future of my commercial real estate firm. The room erupted into loud cheers and enthusiastic applause. Patricia and David were clapping the loudest, beaming with genuine pride at the public infidelity of my husband. Julian raised his hand to quiet the room once more. His eyes slowly scanned the massive showroom floor and locked directly onto the small dark window of the coat room where I was standing. He stared right into my eyes through the shadows. As if on a predetermined cue, a tall man wearing a sharp gray suit stepped out from the back of the crowd. He did not look like a wealthy investor or a corrupt politician. He walked with stiff mechanical purpose directly toward the wooden counter of my coat check room. The entire crowd turned their heads to follow his path, their expensive jewelry glittering under the chandeliers. The man stopped right in front of me and reached inside his tailored jacket. "Are you Sasha Davis?" he asked loudly, ensuring his voice carried into the sudden silence of the room. I did not flinch or look away. I simply nodded my head once. The man pulled a thick stack of heavy legal documents from his jacket and slammed them down onto the wooden counter right in front of my face. "You have been officially served," he declared with absolute zero emotion. "These are formal divorce proceedings filed by your husband Julian, along with an immediate residential eviction notice, mandating you vacate your primary property within 24 hours. The man turned around and walked briskly out the back service door, leaving the documents resting on my counter. The entire room erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers and cruel laughter. Hundreds of wealthy guests pointed their manicured fingers at the frumpy, pathetic coat check girl hiding in the dark room, wearing a cheap, oversized polyester uniform. They looked at me with a mixture of absolute pity and deep disgust. Julian stood on the stage smirking down at me like a conquering king who had just successfully executed the ultimate public humiliation. He thought he had completely destroyed my entire life in front of the most powerful people in the city. Suddenly, my father David walked briskly up the acrylic stairs and took the microphone directly from the hand of Julian. He turned to face the whispering crowd of elite guests with a stern, authoritative expression. Patricia stood right below the stage, nodding vigorously in support of whatever my father was about to say. "I want to make something perfectly clear to everyone in this room tonight," David announced loudly into the microphone. "Our entire family completely supports Julian in this difficult but necessary decision. Sasha has always been a miserable dead weight, holding all of us back from achieving our true potential. She lacks the grace, the ambition, and the social intelligence required to be part of our legacy. Julian deserves a vibrant woman like Victoria, and we proudly welcome her into our family tonight." The crowd clapped politely, murmuring their approval of my father's ruthless public disownment. They all stared at the dark coat room, waiting for the pathetic invisible sister to break down into hysterical tears and run away in shame. They expected me to completely shatter under the overwhelming weight of their combined cruelty. I stood perfectly still in the dim light of the tiny room, looking down at the divorce and eviction papers resting on the wooden counter. I did not shed a single tear. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm of absolute clinical detachment. I reached my hands up to the scratchy collar of the hideous, oversized black polyester uniform Jasmine had forced me to wear. My fingers grasped the top plastic button and I slowly began to unfasten the coat. I stood in the dimly lit coat room listening to the vicious words of my father David echoing through the massive showroom. He declared to hundreds of guests that I was nothing but a miserable dead weight holding back our family. He proudly proclaimed that Julian deserved an equal like Victoria and welcomed the mistress of my husband into their corrupt circle. The crowd responded with polite applause. My mother, Patricia, stood right beside the stage, nodding her head in vigorous agreement with every single cruel syllable he spoke. They expected me to collapse onto the floor and sob hysterically into my hands. They wanted me to quietly disappear into the dark night shattered by their betrayal and the sudden delivery of my divorce papers. I reached my hands up to the scratchy collar of the hideous, oversized black polyester uniform Jasmine had forced me to wear. My fingers grasped the top plastic button, and I calmly began to unfasten the garment. I did not shed a single tear for the family I was about to annihilate. I slipped the cheap, heavy fabric off my shoulders and let the ugly uniform drop onto the dusty concrete floor. Underneath the insulting disguise, I was not wearing ordinary civilian clothes. I was wearing a stunning custom-tailored crimson power suit I had specifically purchased for this exact moment. The rich red fabric fit my body perfectly, projecting an aura of absolute unapologetic authority. I smoothed down the lapels of my blazer and adjusted the cuffs of my crisp white silk shirt. I took one deep breath and pushed the heavy wooden door wide open. I stepped out of the dark shadows and walked directly into the blinding overhead lights of the main showroom floor. My sleek black stiletto heels clicked loudly and aggressively against the polished white marble tiles. The sharp rhythmic sound echoed through the silent room, commanding the immediate attention of every single person present. The wealthy investors turned their heads to look at me, expecting to see a weeping woman running for the rear exit. Instead, they saw a senior federal forensic investigator marching straight toward the main stage with the cold, calculated confidence of an apex predator. The sea of elite Atlanta Society members instinctively parted ways to let me through. They stepped backward, forming a wide, clear path for me as I walked directly toward the center of the room. Julian was still standing on the acrylic stage with his arm wrapped tightly around the waist of Victoria. The smug, triumphant smile on his face slowly morphed into a look of absolute confusion as he watched me approach. He looked down at my expensive crimson suit and blinked his eyes in total disbelief. He was unable to process the powerful, confident woman walking toward him. He grabbed the wireless microphone from the silver stand and let out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed through the speakers. "What exactly are you going to do now, Sasha?" He mocked cruelly, leaning over the edge of the stage. "Are you going to stand there and cry in front of all my important business partners? Just take your pathetic eviction papers and leave before security drags you out." I did not stop walking, and I did not bother to answer his pathetic taunt. I completely ignored the existence of my husband and walked right past the main stage. I kept my eyes locked directly on my ultimate target located on the far left side of the massive showroom. The professional disc jockey was standing behind a highly elevated mixing booth, managing the ambient background music and the digital projector system. He watched me approach with wide, nervous eyes, unsure of what I was planning to do. I walked up the two small steps into the technical booth and looked the young man directly in the eyes. I flashed my federal identification badge briefly, but clearly allowing him to see the federal seal. I quietly instructed him to step away from the mixing board immediately and take a long break outside the building. The young man swallowed hard, nodded his head in silent compliance, and quickly ran away from the booth. I took complete control of the central electronic console. I reached down and brutally ripped the primary audio cables right out of the mixing board. The ambient club music instantly died, plunging the entire luxury venue into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The sudden loss of audio caused a wave of anxious murmurs to ripple through the crowded room. I pulled my heavily encrypted federal mobile device from the interior pocket of my crimson blazer. I grabbed the primary digital interface cable connecting the central computer to the massive white projector screen hanging directly behind the main stage. I plugged the interface cable straight into the secure port of my mobile device. I entered my dual authentication passcodes and completely overrode the venue presentation software. The massive projector screen behind Julian and Victoria blinked twice before turning a bright, solid blue. I reached over the mixing board and picked up the secondary wireless microphone the disc jockey had left behind. I turned around to face the hundreds of wealthy elite guests standing on the showroom floor. Patricia and David were staring up at me from the front row, their mouths hanging wide open in utter shock. Preston was standing near the luxury clothing racks, his face turning pale as he realized I had somehow bypassed their private security. Jasmine was glaring at me with pure hatred, completely unaware that her fake fashion empire was seconds away from total federal liquidation. I raised the microphone to my lips and allowed my voice to boom powerfully across the completely silent room. I am so incredibly glad you all could make it here tonight to celebrate the tremendous financial success of my family, I announced smoothly, letting the heavy dark sarcasm drip from every single word. Julian and Preston have worked so incredibly hard to build this glamorous illusion for all of you. They have gone to truly extraordinary lengths to secure their wealth and cement their legacy in this great city. I paused for a second and looked directly into the terrified eyes of my husband. Let's take a close look at exactly how successful they really are, I said coldly. The massive projector screen flashed brilliantly to life. The high-definition projector illuminated the entire showroom with a blinding white light. Julian and Victoria shielded their eyes as a massive digital document appeared on the wall directly behind them. I stood in the elevated technical booth and spoke clearly into the microphone. My voice was completely devoid of any emotion, projecting absolute authority across the room. I directed the attention of the crowd to the detailed bank statement glowing brightly on the screen. It was a high-resolution capture of a federal corporate credit card transaction. The amount was exactly $120,000 paid directly to an elite Miami yacht charter company. I coldly explained to the audience that my husband did not pay for his luxurious romantic vacation using his own hard-earned money. He illegally bypassed my private security protocols and committed federal wire fraud using a government-issued corporate black card. I made sure to highlight the specific date and time of the illegal transaction, proving it occurred on the exact same day I had physically collapsed from severe exhaustion. The wealthy guests began murmuring in deep confusion and absolute shock. Julian dropped his arm from around the waist of Victoria. His perfect, confident posture immediately collapsed as he stared up at his own digital fingerprint displayed largely for everyone to see. I pressed a single key on my mobile device, and the giant screen instantly transitioned to the next piece of undeniable evidence. A detailed real estate mortgage contract appeared on the wall, illuminating the dark room. I pointed out the specific address of the property listed on the document. It was my own residential home located in the upscale Buckhead neighborhood. I calmly narrated the exact timeline of events for the captivated audience. I told them that while I was lying completely unconscious in a hospital bed suffering from severe physical dehydration, my husband and my brother-in-law were incredibly busy destroying my financial future. They secretly orchestrated a fraudulent secondary mortgage against my personal property to extract $500,000 in stolen equity. I magnified the bottom section of the legal contract so everyone could clearly see the forged notary stamp and the blatantly fake signature. Patricia and David let out simultaneous loud gasps of sheer horror. They finally realized the deep legal jeopardy they were in, because they had eagerly signed that exact same document as primary financial witnesses. They had willingly participated in a massive federal crime just to fund the pathetic fake fashion empire of their favorite golden child. I did not give my family a single second to breathe or formulate a defensive lie to protect themselves. I tapped the glass screen of my phone again and brought up a highly complex financial flowchart. This was the absolute undisputed masterpiece of my federal forensic accounting career, meticulously tracking every single stolen dollar. The bright display showed the direct digital linkage between the forged residential mortgage and a massive tangled web of offshore banking accounts. I highlighted the personal signatures of Preston and Julian resting, right next to the illegal routing numbers for empty shell companies located in the Cayman Islands and the nation of Cyprus. I coldly explained how Julian was actively inflating commercial property appraisals and funneling illicit cash kickbacks directly into these secret offshore accounts over the past 2 years. Preston was utilizing his elite position as a wealthy investment banker to successfully wash the dirty real estate money across international borders without triggering banking alarms. Preston stood completely frozen near the expensive silk clothing racks, unable to comprehend what was happening. The arrogant, mocking smirk he always wore had completely vanished from his pale, intensely sweating face. He looked exactly like a trapped wild animal, realizing the inescapable trap was built by the exact same woman he had constantly mocked and routinely underestimated. I advanced to the final devastating slide of my presentation. The screen displayed the internal retail ledgers for the luxury fashion boutique we were currently standing inside right now. I spoke with razor-sharp clinical precision as I mathematically deconstructed the entire fake glamorous empire of my older sister. I exposed the ugly, brutal truth to her wealthy elite friends and local politicians who had gathered to blindly celebrate her. I clearly explained that Jasmine was not a brilliant female entrepreneur or a successful fashion designer with incredible independent business acumen. Her entire luxury brand was nothing but a highly sophisticated money laundering front, deliberately designed to clean the dirty cash generated by the illegal commercial real estate scams of Julian. The expensive silk dresses, the crystal chandeliers, and the premium catering were fully funded by stolen home equity and fraudulent corporate federal loans. Jasmine let out a loud, piercing scream of pure humiliation that echoed off the high ceiling. She dropped her designer champagne glass onto the hard marble floor where it shattered loudly into 100 tiny, sharp pieces. Her perfectly curated social image evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, greedy criminal exposed to the light. The high society guests finally understood the severe legal and political danger of their current situation. They realized they were standing inside an active criminal money laundering syndicate while drinking expensive champagne fully funded by federal wire fraud. Pure absolute panic instantly erupted across the massive showroom floor as the reality of the federal investigation finally set in. Wealthy politicians and corrupt real estate investors began aggressively pushing past each other in a desperate, frantic attempt to reach the front glass doors, abandoning their unfinished drinks. They wanted to escape the building as fast as possible before their personal reputations were permanently destroyed by any association with my family. Preston suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state of utter shock. His face rapidly contorted into a dark, ugly mask of absolute violent, uncontrollable rage. He pointed a visibly shaking finger directly up at the technical booth where I was standing above the crowd. He screamed at the hired private security guards to climb the stairs and grab me immediately. He yelled at the top of his lungs that I was completely crazy and desperately demanded someone cut the power to the entire building. He aggressively pushed his way through the fleeing, chaotic crowd and charged directly toward the elevated stage with his fists tightly clenched and murder in his eyes. Preston pushed his way brutally through the terrified crowd of fleeing politicians and wealthy investors. His expensive tailored suit jacket tore at the shoulder as he violently shoved an elderly socialite out of his destructive path. He sprinted directly toward the elevated acrylic stage where I was standing completely still. His face was a terrifying mask of absolute murderous rage. Veins bulged aggressively against the pale skin of his neck, and his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He was screaming chaotic, vulgar insults at the top of his lungs, demanding that the private security guards grab me and drag me out of the building. He honestly believed he could use physical violence to silence the truth and protect his offshore money laundering syndicate. I simply stood my ground and watched the beautiful trap snap completely shut. Preston was blind with his own massive ego and completely oblivious to his surroundings. He failed to realize that the federal government does not care about his luxury suits or his expensive cars. Before Preston could even place a single foot onto the bottom step of the acrylic staircase, The illusion of his absolute power was permanently shattered. Three men wearing the crisp white shirts of the luxury catering company suddenly dropped their expensive silver trays of caviar and champagne onto the marble floor. The heavy glass shattered instantly, but the sound was completely drowned out by the sudden explosive violence of their movements. These men were not ordinary event staff, hired to serve drinks to the Atlanta elite. They were highly trained undercover federal tactical agents who had been physically monitoring the entire room all evening long, waiting patiently for my direct command. Their transformation from submissive waiters to elite law enforcement operators was absolutely breathtaking to witness. The three agents moved with terrifying synchronized precision, utilizing years of intense tactical training. The first agent hit Preston directly in the center of his chest, executing a flawless physical tackle that knocked the air completely out of the arrogant banker. Preston crashed violently onto his back against the hard white marble floor, sliding several feet from the sheer momentum of the heavy tackle. The second and third undercover agents instantly dropped their body weight onto his struggling frame. They pinned his shoulders and legs firmly to the ground, stripping away every single ounce of physical control he possessed. Preston thrashed wildly, like a caught animal screaming completely incoherent threats and demanding they release him immediately. The agents expertly twisted his arms behind his back and secured his wrists with heavy industrial zip ties. His pale face was pressed humiliatingly flat against the cold marble tiles, right directly in front of the massive digital projector screen that was currently broadcasting all of his federal financial crimes to the entire world. At that exact same moment, a loud mechanical crashing sound echoed from the front of the luxury boutique. The heavy tinted glass doors of the main entrance were violently forced open. The rear service doors adjacent to my dark little coat room burst open simultaneously. Dozens of Federal Bureau of Investigation and Internal Revenue Service agents flooded into the massive showroom from every single possible exit point. They were wearing heavy tactical vests with bright yellow letters clearly identifying their federal agencies. The blinding beams of their tactical flashlights cut through the dim atmospheric lighting of the luxury venue. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the federal government instantly paralyzed the entire crowd of wealthy Atlanta elites. Men who were used to giving orders and controlling massive corporations were suddenly reduced to terrified bystanders trembling in fear. Women wearing thousands of dollars in designer jewelry dropped their expensive purses and raised their shaking hands high into the air without even being asked. The panicked guests, who had been desperately trying to flee the building, suddenly froze in their tracks, completely surrounded by armed federal investigators. I stepped forward to the very edge of the elevated technical booth and raised the microphone back up to my lips. I reached inside the breast pocket of my custom-tailored crimson power suit and pulled out my heavy leather badge wallet. I flipped it open and held my official golden federal shield high in the air for every single person in the room to clearly see. The bright polished metal reflected the harsh tactical flashlights, illuminating my position of absolute power. "I am Senior Forensic Investigator Sasha Davis," I announced, my voice projecting absolute, unquestionable federal authority over the chaotic room. "Nobody leaves this building. This entire location is now an active federal crime scene, and every single person present is currently being detained for processing." The absolute shock on the faces of the crowd was a profound masterpiece of poetic justice. Down on the main floor, Julian finally snapped out of his paralyzed state of utter shock. He realized the massive scope of the federal raid and decided to abandon absolutely everyone to save himself, proving once again what a cowardly, opportunistic parasite he truly was. He dropped the hand of Victoria, leaving his stunned mistress standing completely alone near the luxury clothing racks, entirely vulnerable and completely confused. Julian turned around and began sprinting frantically toward the dark hallway leading to the rear emergency exit. His custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo jacket flapped wildly behind him as he ran. He thought his athletic build would allow him to outrun the massive consequences of his financial betrayals. He did not even make it 10 feet down the narrow corridor before a massive shadow stepped directly into his path. The lead tactical agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been waiting patiently near the back exit for someone to try exactly that foolish maneuver. The heavily armored agent did not even slow down as he stepped forward to intercept my fleeing husband. He grabbed Julian firmly by the lapels of his expensive midnight blue tuxedo and brutally slammed his entire body against the reinforced concrete wall of the hallway. The loud, sickening thud of the physical impact echoed clearly over the ambient noise of the terrified crowd. The lead agent swiftly kicked the legs of Julian apart, forcing him into a deeply humiliating submission posture against the wall, while quickly securing his hands with heavy metal cuffs. The smooth, charismatic real estate broker, who had proudly flaunted his infidelity just 10 minutes ago, was now weeping openly like a terrified child. Jasmine was standing near the center display tables, staring at the absolute destruction of her fake glamorous empire. She was sobbing hysterically as an armed female federal agent ordered her to place her hands behind her back. The beautiful white silk pantsuit she had worn to project ultimate power was now wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne. She looked around the room begging her wealthy high society friends to help her, but they all completely ignored her pleas. The corrupt politicians and dirty real estate investors were far too busy frantically calling their own high-priced defense attorneys to care about the fake fashion designer they had worshipped just an hour ago. Victoria was backed into the corner near the front windows, her hands trembling violently. She was desperately trying to unfasten the stolen heirloom diamond necklace from her throat before the authorities noticed she was wearing stolen property. Her fingers slipped and fumbled against the intricate gold clasp as a female agent shined a blinding flashlight directly into her terrified face. I slowly lowered my federal badge and looked down at the chaotic main floor from my elevated position. I watched the federal agents systematically establishing absolute physical control over the entire money laundering syndicate, directing suspects into organized lines for immediate processing. I had spent my entire life being treated as the invisible, boring sister who existed only to be exploited and mocked by the people who were supposed to love me. Now I was the highest-ranking federal authority in the room, deciding the permanent fate of every single person who had crossed me. Suddenly, Patricia and David aggressively pushed their way through a small gap in the line of federal agents. They were practically crawling on the marble floor, their expensive formal clothes completely ruined. My parents were crying absolute tears of sheer desperate terror. Their faces were pale and completely distorted by pure panic as they realized the massive federal trap had finally closed around them and there was no escape. They rushed directly to the bottom of the acrylic stairs, leading up to my technical booth, pushing past a heavily armed agent who tried to stop them. They reached their shaking hands out, grabbing desperately at the fabric of my crimson suit pants, their fingers clawing at my legs, like drowning people reaching for a life raft. "Sasha, tell them! It is a mistake!" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with unhinged desperation and utter disbelief. "We are your parents." David sobbed wildly, gripping my leg with sweaty hands. "You cannot let them arrest us." Patricia and David continued to claw frantically at the crimson fabric of my tailored suit. Their faces were slick with sweat as they begged me to call off the raid. They pleaded, citing our connection and demanding protection from the armed agents swarming the boutique. I looked down at the people who had spent my existence making me feel worthless. I felt absolutely no sympathy or familial obligation toward them. I stared at their tear-stained faces with clinical detachment. I reached slowly into my blazer pocket and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I connected the audio output directly into the main venue sound system. I opened the specific digital file I had successfully decrypted from the silver briefcase of Preston. It was a highly compressed audio recording of a voicemail Patricia had foolishly left on his private business phone just a few days ago. I held the heavy microphone close to my mouth and calmly informed the entire room that my parents were not innocent victims in this massive financial conspiracy. I pressed play on my device and let the undeniable truth echo through the massive overhead speakers. The sharp, condescending voice of my mother suddenly filled the dead silence of the showroom floor. Her recorded words were exceptionally clear and utterly devastating. "Bleed that house dry, Preston," her voice sneered through the premium sound system. Jasmine deserves to be a real chief executive officer, and Sasha is just a clueless numbers girl who will never even notice the money is missing. The recording clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Patricia instantly stopped crying and released her tight grip on my pant leg. The last remaining drops of color completely drained from her face as she realized her own arrogant words had just sealed her permanent destruction. David stumbled backward away from me, his hands shaking violently, as the wealthy Atlanta elite stared at them with pure, unadulterated disgust. I nodded my head slightly toward the back of the room. Two senior agents from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division marched forcefully through the crowd. They stepped directly in front of my completely paralyzed parents. The lead agent did not offer them any professional courtesy or gentle explanations. He pulled two thick stacks of federal legal documents from his briefcase and shoved them directly into the trembling hands of my father. He loudly declared that these were official federal asset seizure notices authorized by a federal judge just 3 hours ago. He coldly informed David and Patricia that because they had willingly signed their names as primary financial guarantors on the forged secondary mortgage documents, they were now legally categorized as active co-conspirators in a federal money laundering syndicate. The agent stated that their pristine suburban home in Buckhead, their extensive stock portfolios, and their entire combined retirement accounts were all instantly and permanently frozen by the United States government. They had absolutely nothing left to their names. They were completely broke and facing decades in federal prison. Patricia collapsed onto her knees on the cold marble floor, unable to support her own body weight. Across the massive showroom floor, the chaotic scene continued to unfold with brutal efficiency. Two armed female tactical agents grabbed Jasmine firmly by the arms and violently twisted them behind her back. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around her delicate wrists. Jasmine kicked her expensive designer heels against the floor and thrashed her body around like a spoiled toddler, throwing a massive temper tantrum. Her stunning white silk pantsuit was now completely ruined, covered in dark scuff marks and spilled champagne. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding that someone call her private attorney and threatening to sue the entire federal government for ruining her grand opening event. The agents completely ignored her ridiculous threats and dragged her forcefully toward the front glass doors. Her elite high society friends actually stepped out of the way to let the agents pass, turning their backs on her in her moment of absolute humiliation. Her fake glamorous empire had completely dissolved into dust. Near the front display windows, I spotted a flash of bright red silk, attempting to quietly slip away. Victoria had taken off her high heels and was desperately trying to crawl behind a long rack of expensive luxury coats to reach the side emergency exit door. She thought she could simply sneak away into the dark Atlanta night and pretend she had nothing to do with the criminal syndicate. A massive tactical agent stepped directly into her escape path, blocking the door completely. He grabbed her firmly by the shoulder and pulled her back into the bright light of the showroom. He ordered her to place her hands behind her back and informed her she was being placed under immediate arrest. He loudly stated her primary charge was the knowing receipt and possession of highly valuable stolen property. He pointed his heavy flashlight directly at the sparkling diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. He informed her that the heirloom jewelry belonged to my late grandmother and that she was going to federal prison for accepting stolen goods. Victoria burst into hysterical tears, begging the agent to let her go, claiming Julian had forced her to wear it. I slowly walked down the acrylic steps of the technical booth and made my way across the showroom floor. I stopped directly in front of my husband. Julian was firmly pinned against the concrete wall by the lead tactical agent, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. His expensive midnight blue tuxedo was torn and covered in white dust from the struggle. His handsome, charming face was completely distorted by sheer absolute terror as he stared into my cold, calculating eyes. He looked at the devastating wreckage of his entire life scattered across the marble floor. His mistress was crying in handcuffs. His fake business empire was destroyed, and his wealthy enablers were completely bankrupt. He swallowed hard and looked up at me with a pathetic expression of total defeat. He whispered that I had planned this entire trap from the very beginning. I stepped uncomfortably close to his face and leaned in so only he could hear my voice. I whispered back that I had been quietly planning his total destruction since the exact moment he told me he was at work. Exactly 1 week after the federal raid shattered their luxurious illusion, I sat comfortably in the absolute darkness of an observation room located deep inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation regional headquarters. The heavy soundproof glass, separating me from the primary interrogation chamber, provided the perfect unobstructed view of the three people who had spent my entire life trying to destroy my self-worth. I drank a hot cup of black coffee and stared clinically through the reinforced two-way mirror, analyzing their broken body language and relishing the absolute power of this silent, isolated vantage point. Sitting on the opposite side of the cold steel table were Julian Preston and Jasmine. Their glamorous high society aesthetic had been brutally and efficiently stripped away by the harsh reality of the federal justice system. They were all wearing identical loose-fitting bright orange prison jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were securely bound by heavy iron chains that clinked loudly against the metal chairs every time they nervously shifted their body weight, trying to find a tiny shred of physical comfort that absolutely did not exist within these fortified walls. The fluorescent overhead lights cast deep dark shadows under their exhausted eyes, highlighting the absolute sheer terror radiating from their pale faces. Jasmine looked absolutely unrecognizable without her expensive silk dresses and her team of professional makeup artists. Her natural hair was messy and unkempt, pulled back into a hasty, uneven ponytail. The golden child who had relentlessly mocked my plain appearance just a few days ago was now shivering under the freezing air conditioning of the federal detention facility, staring blankly at the concrete floor. Preston sat rigidly in his metal chair, with his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. His arrogant investment banker persona was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, nervous energy of a cornered rat who finally realized his wealth could not buy his way out of a federal indictment. Julian was arguably in the worst physical condition of the three, sweating profusely through the thin fabric of his assigned federal jumpsuit and muttering incoherent, panicked prayers under his breath. My treacherous husband kept bouncing his knee aggressively against the table, biting his fingernails down to the quick. His charismatic real estate broker smile had completely vanished, leaving behind a desperate, pathetic coward who was frantically trying to calculate a way to save his own skin from the terrifying reality of federal prison, where his smooth sales tactics would mean absolutely nothing to the hardened inmates waiting inside. The heavy metal door to the interrogation room swung open, and the lead tactical agent walked inside carrying a massive stack of thick manila folders. He dropped the heavy federal files directly onto the center of the steel table, making a loud, booming sound that caused all three suspects to violently flinch. The agent did not yell or act aggressively. He simply pulled out a metal chair and sat down calmly, looking at them with a completely bored expression. He slowly opened the first folder and began reciting the overwhelming mountain of undeniable physical evidence we had meticulously gathered against them. He listed the fraudulent offshore accounts, the fake boutique ledgers, the wire fraud violations, and the digital tracking beacons hidden inside the jackets of their corrupt partners. Before the agent could even finish reading the second page of the federal indictment, Julian completely cracked under the immense psychological pressure. He lunged forward as far as his heavy iron wrist chains would allow and slammed his hands onto the table. He frantically begged the agent for a formal plea deal, willing to trade his entire family for just a tiny sliver of personal mercy. Julian wildly offered to testify completely against Preston, promising to surrender every single hidden password and offshore routing number if the federal government would just grant him immunity and a significantly reduced prison sentence, so he could eventually return to his fake, glamorous lifestyle outside these cold concrete walls. Preston instantly snapped his head toward Julian and let out a vicious roar of pure, absolute hatred. "You pathetic, weak coward," Preston screamed, struggling violently against his heavy iron restraints while trying to lunge across the table at my husband. Preston completely abandoned his right to remain silent and began viciously tearing Julian apart, exposing every single dirty secret they had kept hidden in the shadows. Preston loudly confessed to the federal agent that Julian was not just sleeping with Victoria, but had actively maintained 3 other secret mistresses funded entirely by the stolen real estate kickbacks. Preston brutally mocked Julian, calling him a massive financial failure who was completely incapable of closing a legitimate commercial deal without committing federal fraud. Jasmine immediately joined the chaotic screaming match, turning completely against her own husband and my treacherous husband. She began sobbing hysterically and pointing her chained hands at both men, blaming them for ruining her pristine public image. Jasmine frantically told the federal agent that Preston had physically forced her to sign the fake corporate documents and that she was nothing but an innocent victim of their greedy, toxic masculinity. The 3 of them turned on each other like a pack of starving wolves, viciously tearing each other to shreds, in a desperate, frantic attempt to escape the severe consequences of their own calculated actions. They loudly confessed to secondary crimes the Bureau had not even officially discovered yet, freely handing the federal government decades of additional prison time just out of pure spite and deep mutual hatred. I stood perfectly still in the dark observation room, watching the pathetic destruction of their corrupt criminal syndicate. The heavy metal door behind me clicked open, and my senior federal director stepped quietly into the viewing booth. He stood right beside me and watched the 3 suspects screaming at each other through the soundproof glass. He turned to me and gently asked if I wanted to offer them a reduced sentence in exchange for their full and complete cooperation with the ongoing international investigation. I looked at the desperate faces of the greedy, arrogant people who had ruthlessly abused me for over 3 decades. I slowly shook my head, feeling a massive weight completely lift off my weary shoulders. No deals, I whispered, never breaking my intense stare. Prosecute them to the absolute fullest extent of the law and let them rot inside. 6 months later, the heavy wooden gavel of the federal judge slammed down against the acoustic-sounding block, echoing with absolute finality across the packed Atlanta courtroom. I sat in the front row of the polished mahogany gallery, wearing a pristine tailored navy blue suit, watching the total conclusion of their criminal empire. Julian and Preston stood side by side wearing matching dull orange federal prison jumpsuits, their wrists heavily bound in thick iron chains. Their high-priced defense attorneys had completely failed to save them from the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence my federal team had submitted. The stern federal judge did not offer a single ounce of judicial mercy to the men who had spent years manipulating the banking system and stealing from innocent victims. She looked down from her elevated wooden bench and officially sentenced both Julian and Preston to 15 consecutive years inside a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. Julian physically collapsed against the defense table, weeping openly in front of the local news reporters, while the armed federal marshals grabbed his arms and dragged him forcefully out of the courtroom through a heavy steel side door. Preston simply stared blankly at the floor, completely broken and fully stripped of his arrogant investment banker persona. The financial destruction of my older sister occurred with equal absolute brutality just a few miles away from the federal courthouse. The Internal Revenue Service had moved swiftly and aggressively to seize every single asset tied to the offshore money laundering syndicate. The fake luxury boutique of Jasmine was completely liquidated by federal agents, her expensive silk dresses and crystal chandeliers auctioned off to the highest bidder to satisfy the massive government fines. The glamorous high society lifestyle influencer was now forced to clock in at 6 o'clock every single morning at a local discount retail store. Jasmine currently wears a cheap, scratchy polyester employee vest, sorting discounted shoes and scanning clearance barcodes for minimum wage. Every single paycheck she earns is instantly garnished by the federal government, leaving her with barely enough loose change to afford a daily bus pass. Her wealthy elite friends and local politicians had completely blocked her phone number, pretending she simply did not exist. The golden child who had once mocked my boring accounting career was now trapped in a permanent cycle of brutal poverty, working relentlessly just to pay off a staggering multi-million-dollar tax evasion debt she would never ever escape. My parents suffered a parallel fate of profound and deeply humiliating social isolation. The federal government had officially seized their pristine suburban home in Buckhead, along with their entire stock portfolios and lifetime retirement accounts, because they had willingly signed the forged mortgage documents as primary financial guarantors. Patricia and David were abruptly forced to move into a tiny rundown studio apartment located in a heavily industrialized and neglected sector of the city. The walls of their new cramped home were incredibly thin, and the ancient plumbing leaked constantly into their small stained sink. The wealthy country club associates and elite neighbors who had once attended their lavish dinner parties completely ostracized them, treating my parents like highly contagious carriers of a deadly social disease. They were entirely cut off from the glamorous world they had spent 40 years desperately trying to infiltrate. My encrypted phone vibrated softly in my pocket, receiving a new incoming voicemail. I looked down at the bright digital screen and saw the caller identification belonged to Patricia. The automated transcription software quickly translated her desperate weeping audio message into plain text. My mother was begging for financial forgiveness, crying hysterically about the cold drafts in their tiny apartment, and pleading for just a single chance to rebuild our broken family connection. I did not bother to listen to the audio recording or read the rest of her pathetic apologies. I simply pressed the red digital trash can icon and permanently deleted her message without a single ounce of hesitation or lingering guilt. I tucked the encrypted mobile device back into my pocket and walked out onto the expansive glass balcony of my brand new multi-million-dollar penthouse suite. The warm evening breeze swept across the high-altitude terrace, carrying the faint ambient sounds of the bustling city below. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows behind me revealed a sprawling, open-concept living space, decorated with custom modern art and sleek minimalist furniture. The space was not empty or cold. It was completely filled with the warm, energetic laughter of my chosen family. My senior federal director, my loyal forensic accounting colleagues, and the undercover tactical agents who had executed the flawless boutique raid were all gathered inside my beautiful home, celebrating a massive federal victory. They were people who respected my sharp intellect, valued my absolute dedication, and actively protected my well-being when the people bound to me by blood had completely failed to do so. I had successfully purged the toxic parasitic elements from my daily existence and replaced them with genuine supportive allies who actually understood the true profound meaning of loyalty. I walked to the very edge of the glass railing and looked out over the glittering, endless skyline of downtown Atlanta. The towering skyscrapers sparkled aggressively against the dark velvet sky, projecting a beautiful picture of endless, limitless potential. The profound, overwhelming sense of absolute total freedom washed completely over my entire soul, confirming that I had finally won my long war for true independence. I reached over to a small silver table and picked up a chilled crystal flute filled with the most expensive vintage champagne available in the city. I felt the cool, smooth glass against my fingertips and took a long, slow breath of the fresh, unburdened air. I had not just barely survived the most brutal emotional and financial betrayal of my entire life, I had clinically and ruthlessly annihilated every single parasite who had tried to build their fake empires upon my broken back. I raised my crystal glass high into the air, offering a silent, solitary toast to the breathtaking, beautiful city lights spreading out before me. I took a deep, satisfying sip of the crisp, sparkling wine and allowed a genuinely triumphant smile to spread widely across my face as the shadows of the night fully embraced my new, beautiful reality. The story of Sasha teaches us that true power is found in composure, competence, and self-worth. When those she trusted tried to diminish her by labeling her as just a numbers girl, they underestimated the very skills that led to their downfall. The lesson is clear: do not let others define your value or your limits. Emotional intelligence combined with professional excellence can turn the most devastating betrayals into opportunities for liberation. True independence requires the courage to detach from toxic relationships, set firm boundaries, and reclaim your narrative. You are the architect of your own justice and the master of your future, ready to transform your setbacks into your greatest strength. Start building your own path to independence and clarity today.